I would like to introduce the first speaker is Dr. Mary Labbé from the University of Toronto, and she will be presenting the background to the sodium working group, of which she was a member. The way this session will work is that both speakers will give a presentation of about 20 minutes, and then each will have between 5 and 10 minutes for a response, and then we will open this up for discussion. So, Dr. Labbé.
Thanks very much, Harold, and I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here today to, well, I don't know if I want to thank them. This has been an interesting topic to be part of lately, but I'm going to give you some perspectives of really, I think in the end, help explain why we might say there's a lot of noise and questions about what's going on with sodium. So, by way of disclosure, the only thing I have related to sodium was a grant from the Agriculture Cluster supported by the Dairy Farmers of Canada, which was doing consumer research towards lower sodium cheese. So, I'm not going to speak as much about the sodium working group report in Canada, and that's available at Health Canada's website and many other places, but I was also a member of the WHO panel on diet and chronic disease, and as part of that review panel, we actually released a report in December 2012. It probably didn't show up on the website till about January 2013, but it was the guidelines for sodium intake for adults and children. And there's actually 4 parts if you want to actually go and look at that assessment. There's the guidelines report, which is the main one on the, I don't even know which side, your left. And then there are also 2 detailed technical reports that actually look at the full meta-analysis, and they're 100-plus page reports, and they go through every study, everyone that was included, excluded, and all the criteria in the meta-analysis, and then both for adults and for children. And we were also tasked to look at a number of endpoints as well as potential adverse effects. And the meta-analysis were also summarized in a meta-analysis journal article that was published in British Medical Journal last spring. So these are sort of the basis of some of the data I'll talk to you about. And I think one of the things we also have to keep mind of, and it could be sodium or it could be anything, that when we're talking about setting guidelines, whether it's globally or for countries, we actually do systematic review of all the evidence. So we don't pick and choose and use some of it. We don't drive recommendations by 1 or 2 studies. It's actually a synthesis of all the evidence. And I think that's really important, particularly now as we're looking at with sodium, because there is some evidence out there. And the next point is not just looking at the totality of evidence, but you actually have to look at the quality of the different evidence. And I think that's an important concept as we go through these. And many of us have seen these types of diagrams. This comes from the grade process that the World Health Organization uses. But you grade every study by the quality of that study. And there's a lot of concern saying, well, it's really hard for dietary studies because there's very few RCTs, and those would be the ones that are least subject to bias. But there are a large number of prospective case cohort studies that are well characterized and then followed for a large number of years. And then there's some non-systematic observations, and then ecological studies which tend to compare populations across countries around the world. And those are the lowest quality evidence. So I want you to keep that in mind, because that becomes important as we look at the types of data that are out there when we make decisions. And so one of the things that the World Health did, in not just our panel, but it was set up as a group of methodologists, is to actually say that if you want to look with a variety of studies, you don't want to just pick RCTs. It doesn't work for dietary assessments. You want to be able to account for all the types of studies. So although we started in that first slide where, sort of the highest rating would be the RCTs and the lowest would be observational cohorts, then you have the ability within each type. So if you started off at one of these groups, and I don't know if this will work here. Does that work? Is it sliding around? No, it isn't. Okay. If you worked at something like the RCTs, you might have quite high points, but then you can actually rate it down if there were serious inconsistencies, they hadn't blinded the samples, there was indirect, or if you started with some of the observational studies, you could actually in turn upgrade them if there were things like there were very large effects were seen, if dose responses were seen, and if they were well adjusted for potential confounders. So what it does is allows us to use a variety of types of studies and adjust them accordingly to the type of study they were firstly, but then adjust them up or down depending on the quality of the individual studies. So we use that process to help integrate studies from a wide variety of study designs in coming up with their recommendations. And I think this is important to know as we're dealing with something like sodium, where we have a huge number of studies, but there are different types of designs. And I just had already summarized that. So these were the characteristics that we used, particularly in the cohorts and that, to adjust studies up or down appropriately. So the next couple of slides are actually going to be taken from either this meta-analysis that was published in BMJ or in the technical reports with the WHO sodium recommendations. So now, I apologize you can't see this, but maybe this is a good thing, and I don't expect you to know it, but this is a summary of all the studies relating to sodium and resting blood pressure in adults. I think this is systolic blood pressure, but there's a similar one for diastolic. There were actually 36 studies, and these are cohorts and RCTs. The effect was minus 3.9. It was absolutely significant, minus 4.1 to about 2.5, and there was dose response. And I'll show you a couple other things. So that says we've got the effect. But not only do we have the effect, it's actually quite robust. And one of the things you do in systematic analysis, you often will see heterogeneity, an I-square that may be high or not. And so you look at what's the, does it hold up or is it due to heterogeneity? And we looked at a number of other things. So first one we looked at, is there a difference between having hypertension or not hypertension? There were 7 studies that looked at subjects that no hypertension, and of course many more, 24 with hypertension. And you can, I don't know if you can read it, but you can see the numbers are still statistically significant, whether they were hypertension or non-hypertension, but obviously the effect is greater in those subjects with hypertension. We also looked at the studies whether the sodium was above or below 2 milligrams a day in terms of the actual absolute levels. And there were about 16 studies that compared subjects above or below the 2 grams. And in both cases, they did show effects. We also were asked, we looked at a group of studies that were below 1,500, it happened to be 1,200. We didn't see an effect. So there wasn't significant difference when you try to power down to those really low levels of sodium. There just weren't enough studies. There only were 3 studies. So you can see that if we go down lower and lower, our power to detect differences is smaller. And we looked at if irregardless of what sodium level was, if it was a study where at least a third of reduction was achieved, those are also significantly different. We also looked at, and I won't go through every one of them, but it held up for duration, it held up by sex, it held up by which blood pressure device was used, what blood pressure measuring was done, whether or not they were on blood pressure medication, and different types of study designs. So the effect between sodium and blood pressure was considered very, very robust and very strong. And this is a graphical representation from an earlier study, now almost 10 years ago, but it's useful just to show the types of effect you see with blood pressure. So if you look at the blue lines, these are the studies of the subjects with hypertension. And then as you shift across from 3,600 to 1,200 milligrams a day, you can see that as you go down, the decrease in blood pressure is very high if your intakes are very high, and the magnitude of that reduction is smaller as you get lower in sodium. Similarly, if you look at the red lines, which are normal hypertensive individuals, you see that same pattern, but the magnitude of the difference is much smaller. And then, of course, if you're at a lower reduction and a normal tensives, the magnitude is smaller. And so what these studies, putting them together in terms of the reductions in adults, there actually were 49 comparisons, and the average reduction overall was about a 3 millimeter mercury reduction in adults of systolic and about 1.5 for diastolic blood pressure. And it was higher than that, closer to 5 if they were hypertensive individuals and closer to 2 if they were normotensive individuals. I think importantly, because this is a group that is actually at lower levels of hypertension, there are 14 studies in children, which, although very small, when they're done by meta-analysis, those reductions were also significantly reduced, so only 1 millimeter mercury. But it says that even in a child with much lower sodium levels, like much lower blood pressures, you still see a reduction in blood pressure with a reduction in sodium intakes. So that really gives additional strength to that dose response effectiveness of sodium reducing blood pressure. So that was blood pressure, good and strong, and I don't think anybody is going to dispute the sodium effects on blood pressure. The next question is sodium intakes on cardiovascular disease. So this is a table from our meta-analysis in the WHO, and I apologize because I just clipped it off. It may not be that strong, but if we actually looked at the first one with the red arrow is sodium on all stroke. The quality evidence there is very low. There's only an elevated risk of 24%, but the error crosses just from 1.08 to 1.43, and the studies were considered low-quality evidence for a variety of methodological issues, sample size. Similarly, combined stroke, non-fatal and fatal, similarly low evidence, and stroke fatal, low evidence, and overall coronary heart disease, also low evidence. So we actually looked at every single study that looked at heart outcomes in terms of cardiovascular disease, either an event or a death. And there just aren't that many studies there. In most cases, if you look at the third column, the number of participants in the studies and the number of studies, you can see that the number of studies in brackets, the most is 10 studies that looked at stroke, but some of them 3 studies. So you can see why there's no significant effect. There just aren't many studies out there. And that's not surprising. If you were looking at a study, unless you're in a clinical trial, it's unlikely to find populations with low sodium intakes that you could follow over years and find out that there was reduced cardiovascular disease. And this summarized it all together, where all those studies in our analysis were considered low quality evidence or very low but high for blood pressure. So now I want to put it in the second half of my presentation, I want to put it in context. So we said there was a strong association between sodium and blood pressure. If you look at some of the other reports that have come out from the IOM and basically the underpinnings of all our pharmaceutical interventions, sodium and blood pressure is an accepted biomarker or risk factor for heart outcomes for cardiovascular disease. Virtually every drug review agency has used blood pressure changes as the surrogate outcome or the marker for reducing cardiovascular disease. So sodium is no different from every pharmaceutical that we're currently using out there in the marketplace. And this just summarizes, there's 4 plots here, the effects of blood pressure and health outcomes. In other words, is reducing blood pressure really important? And I think there's 147 randomized controlled trials that says yes. You get a significant reduction in mortality or events with lowering blood pressure. So that's the basis of why sodium reducing blood pressure is an important contributor. And, oops, I went down the wrong way. So I think this slide sort of summarizes what came of our WHO studies, that there was high-graded evidence that reduces blood pressures, high-graded evidence that I didn't go through it, that there was no adverse effects with lowering sodium when you had these blood pressure reductions, but very low quality evidence in looking at that association between sodium and cardiovascular disease. And if you look at those are actually an ABC. So you have a relationship of sodium causes blood pressure lowering results in cardiovascular disease. Those 2 steps are very well accepted. Where the problem is going directly from lowering sodium to lowering the cardiovascular outcomes. There just isn't much data there. And I think that's part of the confusion. And so if I go to, this is our recommendations from the WHO. We actually had our recommendations at looking at above and below 2,000, and our evidence was very high that if we could lower sodium to 2,000 milligrams, we would have, and that's the recommendation of WHO, is a 2,000 milligram recommended sodium intake per day. So where's the controversy? And I'm going to go through a couple of the papers, not all of them, but they really go around, as I said, little or no direct evidence for sodium and cardiovascular events. Also around a J-shaped curve, that there may be some concerns have been raised with very low intakes of sodium that would be associated with higher disease rates. And I won't spend a lot of time today, but some scientists have proposed that our natural sodium levels are what we consume, so that should be our normal physiological intakes of sodium, which would be analogous to many other, which is sometimes used for the AIs. That's what we see in people. That's what our recommendations, and that's the lowest quality of evidence for just observationals for, and it's very rarely ever used as a basis for setting nutrient requirements. So, the IOM report, and these are actually the 3 statements I took out of that report, and their report came out to 3 conclusions when they looked at sodium and direct focusing on health outcomes. They concluded that it supported current efforts to reduce excessive sodium intakes to lower both the risk of heart disease and stroke. They said that it was not consistent with lowering sodium levels to below 1,500, which our WHO recommendation actually said the data below 1,500, below 2,000 was not, that was of lower quality data, so we made our recommendation at 2,000 and a strong recommendation on strong evidence as opposed to a weaker recommendation on weaker evidence of going below 2,000. And they actually said that they would need further research to really understand what the association might be between 1,500 and 2,300 milligrams. So they as well recognize that the amount of data in that 1,500 level to 2,000 or 2,300 there isn't as much there. And so the recommendations, in that case, they couldn't make a recommendation at that level. So what's going on? There was a lot of, things in the media saying, well, get your salt shaker back out again when that IOM report came out and that. But I think they had a very narrow charge. The other earlier electrolyte report had already looked at the sodium and blood pressure relationship. So they were really charged with looking at that other relationship because when they set the DRIs, they picked the most sensitive endpoint to examine. So they didn't, by design of the DRIs, didn't have to look at other endpoints. So in this case, this panel was charged with looking at the direct disease outcomes. If you look at that report, there were hardly any studies below 2,000 milligrams. And the ones that were there were a number of things that I think, and I'm going to go over a few things. There was a really, many of the studies, very poor quality studies in terms of assessing what those sodium intakes were of the individuals in the studies. And many of the ones at the very low intake were actually in sick populations. So whether the low sodium intake was due to sick patients having low intakes, low calories, and they're sick, and that's reverse causality that's often caused where it's actually the illness that has the low intake that's responsible for the mortality as opposed to the lower sodium. It's just a tag along of you could look at many other nutrients and their intakes with low, and often case energies are. So this is the study that probably was the study that came out in JAMA, and this showed a J-shaped curve, and a couple of things have come out. The Figure 2 gives all the different relationships between all the different incomes, strokes, stroke events, hospitalizations. One of the things that's been criticized is actually this figure that's the one that's been used most often is probably actually a composite of multiple endpoints because they've all been put together. So the same people who had an event during the course of the follow-up also could be a high probability that they were also the same people who then eventually had a death. And yet you may be double counting some of the same individuals who had both an event or multiple events and then a death. And this study was done by post hoc using all the studies that had salt excretion, in other words, urinary sodium data and the events. All the studies in this trial were actually on cardiovascular disease. They were at high risk of cardiovascular disease, and virtually all of them were on medications. These were actually drug trials that they used the data from. So most of them were in some form of diuretics. And so in a sense, some of the lower ones have also been criticized. They were on the highest doses. The lowest sodium intakes were on the highest doses of diuretics. So it could be an actually confounder by measuring the adverse effects of either the high diuretics or the people that were the least well controlled and needed the highest diuretics. Sodiums were done by just a single morning spot urines, which aren't 24-hour urine collections, and involve quite a bit of mathematical modeling to adjust for total intakes in the past 24 hours. Some have criticized the statistics that they use blonde correlation coefficients, and when they've been reanalyzed using Blonde-Altman plots, the effects disappear. Interestingly, the ones that had the lowest sodium intake also had very low potassium intake. So low potassium is also a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So whether it's an independent risk factor, a co-variable as a risk factor, or it's a marker of incomplete urine collection, there's something going on with those individuals. And this is a cohort of 29,000 individuals, but really in the end of the day, there's only 87 deaths. 52 of them are congestive heart failures of those. So I'm going to give another slide on some of the problems with looking at these heart failure patients, and it may really be, those are very sick patients, and they may not be that relevant to setting recommendations for the general healthy population. And there's some more noise when we talk about that. There was another article that came out in British Medical Journal Heart in 2002 that also looked at low sodium and also had a J-shaped curve showing that the low intakes were associated with mortality. But when we were doing our WHO report, we tried to get the raw data. When you do meta-analysis, you have to combine raw data sets. We asked the authors, and then we asked the journal. Eventually, after we put our report out, that paper was then eventually pulled. Basically, they believed that the data was overanalyzed, like duplicate data repeated twice, and none of the raw data could be produced. So right there, that puts some of those data that were in suspect, but many of those studies got wrapped into other meta-analysis, came up in our WHO report. So we, although we couldn't exclude those papers, we put a cautionary statement saying that, our recommendations don't, and if they're under healthcare provision for certain diseases, you may want to watch sodium intakes, because we had, at this time, this retraction only came out after we did our study. So that's some of the complications that happens, but that was more noise in the system in terms of what was going on with this possible J-shaped curve. And so I guess I'm just going to finish up here saying that, what we have when we're looking at some of those very low sodium intakes, particularly they're mostly observational studies, because as I said earlier, there aren't that many free-living individuals that are naturally taking low sodium intakes that you can then follow them as part of cohorts over long periods of time. There is an eclectic mix of very sick patients in many of these low sodium groups. As I mentioned in the other, there's low potassium intakes, which may either be a marker of incomplete intakes or another risk factor in those groups. Many of the studies, they had very low calorie intakes as well, so that may be a marker. Also, particularly many of the heart failure patient studies that were put in were actually, now this I have to depend on my cardiologist friends here who's explain this to me, because I'm not a cardiologist, but many of those patients who died in that study were not North American patients, and they were on diuretic medications that were up 500, 1,000 milligrams a day. The standard of care in North America is between 40 and 80 milligrams a day, and that may be indirectly competing to the mortality in those people. And the other thing is many of them also may have associated with these diseases renal failure. And if there is renal failure, you also have elevated creatinines, which then if you divide your sodium by your creatinine may look like your sodium's being low as well. So that may be another potential confounder. And I'm going to finish up with two meta-analyses, just to say when I talked about these meta-analysis of a cardiovascular disease, whether it's there or not, this is a Cochrane review done in 2011 that said there was no significant effect. And if you look at the R-squared, I don't know if you can read it, but basically the effect size is a 0.88, so a 12% reduction, but non-significant. It crossed the zero. It went from, I can't even read it myself, but believe me, no significant effect. But in this case, they separated the hypertensives on the bottom and the normotensives on the top, and they had no effect in either group. Using those exact same 5 studies, or 4 studies, was done another meta-analysis in the same year by he and McGregor. When they combine them all, then they see a significant effect of a 20% reduction. So I'll leave it to you whether it's true that there's an effect when you put the whole population together and not an effect when you separate them, or it's just a question of just really being underpowered to detect an effect. So my last slide is where are we at? And I'm sorry, I'm a couple of minutes over. I think we've got very strong evidence linking reduced sodium to reduce blood pressures, both in hypertensive, normotentials, and in children. We've got strong evidence linking sodium, blood pressure reduction and cardiovascular disease reduction, but we really do have little and poor evidence from observational studies linking sodium and cardiovascular disease outcomes. And the studies we do have really have some serious methodological issues that we probably could have. I've been in rooms with people arguing on that for hours and hours. And even when you look at the meta-analysis of the RCTs, well, these are the individuals on the RCTs, and follow them for events, there are very few events to work with, and as I showed you, 2 meta-analysis, one saying positive, one saying negative. You can take your pick which way you want to go, but I would say that probably it's just a lack of power. So in the end, I think in terms of cardiovascular outcomes, I think we're in the situation, we're probably in the situation we have lack of evidence, but I don't think that necessarily means a lack of effect. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much.